Hello everyone. Tonight we begin with something a little darker. Forget the fancy royal parties and beautiful dresses you've seen in TV shows. For the people of Tudor England, fear did not come from an angry king, but from something invisible, fast and deadly. It was not about staying away from sick people or drinking clean water. It was much simpler. You could go to bed feeling perfectly healthy and simply never wake up. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy this content, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always interesting to see who joins us from all over the world. Now lower the lights and let us begin tonight's journey together. The summer of 1485 was coming to an end, and with it, so too it seemed, was the long and bloody war that historians would later call the War of the Roses. On August 7th, a small group of ships, no more than 50 in number, quietly sailed into the waters of Milford Haven on the Welsh coast. On board was a man who represented the last and weakest hope of the House of Lancaster, Henry Tudor. He was a person claiming the throne with a claim that was, to be honest, rather questionable. He had spent the last 14 years of his life as an exile, a political piece in the courts of Brittany and France, always looking over his shoulder, always one step away from being sent back or killed. Now, with the money from his French friend Charles VIII, and an army that was basically a mixed collection of troublemakers, he was returning to the land he barely remembered to take the crown from Richard III, the last Plantagenet king. His army was hardly the best of European warriors. It was made up of about 2,000 French and Scottish soldiers for hire, experienced in battle but loyal only to money, along with a group of English exiles who had risked everything for his cause. It was a small, almost unimportant force with which to invade a kingdom. But Henry was counting on something more. He was counting on his Welsh ancestry. By landing in his native land, he hoped that prophecies of a Welsh hero who would restore the glory of Britain would touch the hearts of his countrymen, and to some extent they did. As his small army moved through the valleys and hills of Wales, its numbers began to grow. Rhys ap Thomas, a powerful Welsh landowner, joined his cause with his men, and other minor nobles followed. Even so, as they marched toward the heart of England, uncertainty must have been a constant companion, as real as the mud on their boots and the weight of their armor. They were an army on the move, a traveling community of thousands of men living under dangerous conditions. They slept in the open or in temporary camps, sharing water from questionable streams and whatever food they could gather along the way. Cleanliness, of course, was non-existent. The smell of sweat, of damp straw, and of fear must have filled everything. In this breeding ground of dirt and exhaustion, any disease could have grown. But what was developing in their ranks was something no one had ever seen before, something silent, invisible, that travelled with them on their fateful march toward destiny. On August 22nd, near a small market town in Leicestershire called Market Bosworth, the two armies met. Richard III's army was much larger, more experienced, and better equipped. On paper, Henry Tudor had no chance, but battle, like life, often turns on betrayal and luck. The crucial betrayal of the Stanley brothers, who watched the battle from a distance with their own forces, changed everything. They attacked the side of King Richard at the critical moment. In an act of desperate courage, Richard charged directly at Henry's banner, trying to end the war with a single strike. He was unhorsed and killed on the field, a brutal end for the last king of a dynasty that had ruled England for over 300 years. The crown, as legend tells it, was found in a hawthorn bush and placed upon the head of Henry Tudor. The Tudor dynasty was born. The victory was total and decisive. Henry VII, now King of England, marched on London to claim his capital and his kingdom. His entry into the city was a carefully planned event designed to impress and make his new power legitimate. He was met with processions, pageants, and the noise of the crowds. It seemed like the beginning of a new era of peace and wealth. But the shadow that had followed his army from the shores of Wales was not just that of war. It was something far darker. Barely 2 weeks after his arrival in the capital in early September, Londoners began to fall ill and to die. It was not the bubonic plague, the old and terrible disease that had terrorized Europe for centuries. Its symptoms were different and its speed terrifying. It first took hold of Henry's soldiers, the very men who had fought at Bosworth. Heroes of the battle fell ill in their rooms, not from wounds of war, but from an unseen sickness that consumed them from within. Then, like a poisonous fog, it spread through the crowded, dirty streets of London. It began quietly with a few cases here and there, but within days it had become a full-blown epidemic. Historians of the time, such as Polydore Virgil, wrote with a mixture of awe and terror of this new plague that seemed to have come from nowhere. They called it with a chilling simplicity, the Sudor Anglicus, the English sweat. The reign of Henry VII, born in the blood of Bosworth Field, was baptized in the feverish sweat of an unknown disease. It was a disturbing sign, a reminder that winning a crown and keeping it were two very different things, and that there were enemies far more deadly than a rival king on a battlefield. The shadow of Bosworth Field had not disappeared with victory. It had merely changed its form, becoming a damp, deadly fog that hung over the dawn of the Tudor age. Imagine for a moment being a citizen of London in that autumn of 1485. The city is buzzing with the news of a new king, a new beginning. The air is filled with hope and caution. And then the rumours begin. A neighbour, a merchant known for his strong health, complained of a chill in the morning. By midday he was in bed. By nightfall he was dead. The story repeats itself in the house next door and on the street across. Panic, like the disease itself, spreads with amazing speed. And what made it so terrifying was its nature, its relentless character, and its brutal efficiency. The disease did not begin with the sores or the black buboes of the plague. There were no warning signs, no time to prepare or say goodbye. It all started almost always with a feeling of dread, a knot in the stomach, a sudden sense of fear that seemed to have no cause. Immediately after came the first physical symptom, a violent chill. This was not a simple shiver from the cold. It was a shaking that shook the entire body, an uncontrollable chattering of teeth, a feeling of icy cold that went deep into the very bone, even in a warm room. This phase of intense cold could last from half an hour to 3 hours, during which the victim felt utterly miserable, often accompanied by a pounding headache, dizziness, and a deep ache in the neck, shoulders, and limbs. And then, as suddenly as the cold had begun, came the heat, and with the heat, the sweat. This was not the normal sweat of a fever. It was something of another level. Historians describe it as a flood. The victim's body would begin to pour liquid from every pore, a sweating so heavy that it soaked the bedclothes, the straw mattress, everything. Puddles would form on the floor. The smell, they said, was unmistakable, a sickly, penetrating, foul odour that filled the room and clung to everything. Along with the sweat came an unquenchable thirst, a heart that beat with a frantic speed, delirium, and total exhaustion. The most terrifying thing was the speed. The course of the disease was a race against time, and the clock was ticking devilishly fast. From the first chill to death could be a matter of mere hours. 24 hours was considered a long time. If a person managed to survive the first 24 hours, it was believed they stood a chance of recovery. This knowledge created an atmosphere of unbearable fear. Once the symptoms appeared, the victim and their family would enter a desperate watch, counting every minute, watching every breath, knowing that the dawn might not come. Death usually came as a sudden collapse, what today we might describe as heart failure or shock due to the extreme loss of water. The body simply gave up. Panic seized London. People fled the city in large numbers, carrying, of course, the disease with them to the surrounding towns and villages. Those who stayed locked themselves in their houses, afraid to breathe the street air. Contact with neighbours was avoided. A single cough in the distance could cause panic. The streets, normally lively and noisy, grew strangely silent. The only sound was the rattle of the death carts. The death rate was horrifying. Although it is impossible to have exact numbers, historians suggest that at the height of the epidemic in London, hundreds were dying each day. It is estimated that in the few weeks this first outbreak lasted, the city lost between 10,000 and 15,000 people, a devastating portion of its total population of around 50,000 souls. The physicians of the day were completely confused and largely useless. The popular medical theory was based on the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and the belief that illness was the result of an imbalance among them. Their treatments were at best useless, and at worst actively harmful. In the face of the English sweat, they recommended bloodletting to remove excess blood or purges aimed to cleanse the body. Imagine the effect of drawing blood from or causing vomiting in a person already suffering from massive loss of water. It was quite literally making things worse. Folk wisdom, however, developed its own method, which was probably far more sensible. The general belief was that one must give in to the sweat. Once it began, the victim was to be put to bed, covered with a mountain of blankets and furs, and all doors and windows were to be sealed to prevent even the slightest breeze. The goal was to keep the sweat flowing steadily for the critical 24 hours. The victim was not allowed to stick even a hand out from under the covers. They were given small amounts of warm ale or posset, a drink of hot milk mixed with wine or ale to replace fluids. Although the fear of chilling the body made many hesitant even to do this, it was a treatment born of desperation, a sort of forced waiting in the hope that the body could somehow expel the poison through the sweat. Whether it worked or not, it is impossible to know. But in a world without answers, any ritual, however strange, offered a small amount of comfort, an illusion of control against an invisible enemy that could take anyone at any time in a flood of fever, dread, and sudden death. And here is where the story of this plague becomes stranger still, and for the upper class of the era, infinitely more terrifying. The great epidemics of history, the Black Death, cholera, smallpox, were often, though not always, diseases of poverty. They grew in the overcrowded, unsanitary areas of the poor, where poor nutrition weakened the immune system and a lack of cleanliness allowed germs to spread unchecked. The wealthy in their more spacious homes and with their better diets could often protect themselves from the worst of it. They had the means to flee to the countryside, to seal up their mansions and wait for the storm to pass. But the English sweat did not respect these rules. In fact, it seemed to actively prefer the rich, the powerful, the healthy. It was a plague with expensive tastes. From the very first outbreak in 1485, observers noted a confusing pattern. The disease seemed to strike with a special preference for young, well-built men, particularly those of the upper classes. Nobles, courtiers, wealthy merchants, high-ranking clergy, mayors and aldermen were dropping like flies, while young children and the elderly seemed to be largely immune. And curiously, the poor in the most miserable slums were often spared. A Flemish historian, bewildered by this strange fact, wrote that the disease chiefly affected those who lived in plenty and laziness. It is a cruel irony, is it not? After generations of telling the peasantry that their suffering on earth would win them heaven, along came a disease that seemed to be a divine punishment for not suffering enough. The first outbreak in London made this painfully clear. In a single week, the city lost its Lord Mayor, Thomas Hill. His replacement, William Stocker, was quickly appointed and died within days, also from the sweat. 6 of the city's aldermen died in the same brief period. This was the equivalent of a modern capital's government being destroyed in a matter of days. Not by a coup, but by a mysterious illness. The administrative chaos added to the social panic. No one was safe, and status and wealth not only offered no protection, they seemed to make you a target. The court of Henry VII, newly established and still uncertain, must have lived in a state of constant terror. The very men who had fought alongside him at Bosworth, who expected to be rewarded with titles and lands, now faced an enemy far more dangerous than the spears of Richard's soldiers. We do not have detailed records of specific nobles who died in 1485, partly because of the chaos of the transition. But the fear was real. Henry postponed his coronation from September 30th to October 30th, waiting for the outbreak to calm down. His wedding to Elizabeth of York, a crucial political move to unite the houses of Lancaster and York, was also delayed until January of the following year. The king, who had won his throne by force of arms, now found himself a prisoner of an invisible fog. His power helpless against a disease he could not understand and could not fight. This pattern would be repeated with even greater clarity in later outbreaks. The one in 1517 was particularly violent in Oxford and Cambridge, the great centres of learning where the sons of the nobility and the gentry were educated. In some of the Oxford colleges, it is said that half the student population died. Imagine the terror of noble families across the country, sending their sons to receive the best possible education, only to have them consumed by the sweat in their university rooms. The disease was quite literally wiping out the future generation of England's leaders. But it was the outbreak of 1528 that brought the terror directly into the heart of Tudor power. By then, Henry VII's son, the energetic and impressive Henry VIII, was on the throne. The sweat struck his court with relentless fury. The king, a well-known worrier about health, despite his tough image, was utterly terrified. He fled London, moving constantly from one royal home to another, breaking up the court and allowing only his personal physician and a few trusted servants to approach him. He separated his then wife, Catherine of Aragon, and his mistress and future queen, Anne Boleyn, sending them to different locations for fear of infection. His fear was well-founded. Anne Boleyn caught the disease. Henry panicked, sent his best physician to attend her, and wrote desperate love letters, Fortunately for her and for the future course of English history, she survived. But many others in their inner circle were not so lucky. William Compton, one of the king's closest friends and advisors, the keeper of the privy purse, died. He was one of the most powerful men at court, and he died within hours. Another devastating blow was the death of William Carey, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber and, more importantly, the husband of Mary Boleyn, Anne's sister. Carey's death left the king's former mistress a widow and their children fatherless, one of whom, it was rumoured, may have been Henry's own. The disease not only killed, but it further tangled the already complicated web of personal and political relationships. At the top of power, the reason for this strange preference for the wealthy and healthy remains a mystery. Some historians guess it could have been diet-related. The nobility ate enormous amounts of meat and alcohol, while the poor lived on bread and vegetables. Perhaps some factor in that protein-rich diet made them more likely to get sick. Others suggest it could have been clothing. The rich wore heavy, fancy layers of wool and velvet, even in summer, which might have created a perfect environment for the germ. Or perhaps, and this is a more recent theory, the germ was a type of hantavirus transmitted through the droppings of rodents. The homes of the poor, with their dirt floors and drafty construction, were airy and ventilated. The mansions of the rich, with their tapestries, rush-matting floors, and sealed windows, might have trapped contaminated air, concentrating the viral particles. Whatever the reason, the psychological effect was huge. The English sweat turned upside down the natural order of things, as it was understood in the 16th century. It was a disease that did not distinguish between lord and peasant, or worse, that seemed to prefer the lord. A nobleman in his fortified castle surrounded by servants and luxuries was more vulnerable than a beggar in an alleyway. This reversal of fortune, this dark equality of death, was deeply unsettling to a rigidly divided society. Money could not buy a cure. Power offered no protection. The plague of nobles reminded everyone from the king to the humblest baron of their own fragile mortality. A lesson the Tudor dynasty, born in uncertainty and violence, would learn again and again under the damp, clinging shadow of the English sweat. For 23 long years, the sweat was little more than a ghost, a horror story whispered by elders to frighten the young, a grim memory of the chaos that had accompanied the birth of the Tudor dynasty. The generation that came of age under the early reign of Henry VIII knew the sickness not first-hand. They had heard of it, of course, of how it had arrived with Henry Tudor's army in 1485, sweeping through the capital and taking 2 London mayors in a single week. But it was history, something that had happened to their parents or their grandparents. Life in early 16th century England had its own concerns. The harvests, the taxes, the endless wars of their young, ambitious king in France. The sweat was a relic stored away in the dusty attic of shared memory. And then in the summer of 1508, the ghost returned. It did not arrive with the dramatic warning of 1485. It was a quieter return, more sneaky. It began, as it almost always did, in the crowded and dirty areas of London, a maze of narrow alleys and timber-framed houses where sanitation was an afterthought and human closeness a constant. At first, the reports were confused. A healthy man complaining of a sudden chill in the morning and buried by dusk. A woman feeling dizzy after her midday meal, her bed already cold before supper. The symptoms were unmistakable to those who remembered them. The violent chill that set the teeth to chattering, followed by a burning heat, a piercing headache, and finally the sweat. A heavy, relentless sweat, with a sour, sickly smell that soaked the bedclothes and seemed to wring the very life from the body. The court of the young Henry VIII, not yet on the throne but the centre of social life, reacted with a mixture of disbelief and rising panic. His father, the old and cunning Henry VII, the man who had survived the battlefields of Bosworth and countless plots, knew what he was facing. He did not hesitate. The court was dissolved. The royal family retreated to the relative safety of the countryside, far from the corrupt air of the capital, believed to carry the disease. For the Tudors, survival was a strategy, not a matter of chance. They had fought too hard for the throne to lose it to an invisible fog. The 1508 outbreak did not have the scale of its predecessor, but its psychological impact was devastating. It shattered the comfortable illusion that the sweat had been a one-time event, a historical oddity tied to the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. Now it was clear that it was a returning threat, a sleeping beast that could awaken in any hot and humid summer. Physicians, powerless, dusted off the old books, offering the same useless advice. Avoid the night air, burn sweet-smelling herbs, cleanse the body, and above all, pray. The disease claimed several important members of society, reminding everyone that wealth and status offered no real protection. Every death among the upper classes sent a ripple of panic through the nobility. Another 9 years passed. 9 years of an uncertain peace with the disease. Henry VIII was king now in the prime of his life, a Renaissance monarch, athletic, charming, and certain of his divine power. The court was a whirlwind of jousts, banquets, and showy diplomacy. England felt strong, and then in 1517 the sweat returned again. This time with greater force and a particular cruelty. This outbreak was different. While London suffered once more, the sickness showed a terrifying fondness for the centres of learning. It spread like wildfire through the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. It was a massacre of the educated class. Young scholars, the future of England's clergy, law, and government, were dropping dead at their desks, books still open before them. The colleges emptied in a matter of days. Teachers fled, followed by their terrified students. The great halls of debate and the libraries fell silent, occupied only by the echo of fear. The disease seemed to mock human knowledge. You could read Galen and Hippocrates. You could debate theology and philosophy. But none of it mattered when the chill ran down your spine. In some colleges, half the student population died. The reaction of Cardinal Wolsey, Henry's powerful Lord Chancellor, and the man who effectively ran England, was a small version of the elite's response. Wolsey, a man who loved power and show, took no chances. He fled London, moving constantly between his many grand homes, keeping people at a distance and obsessively fumigating his rooms. His fear was obvious, and if the most powerful man in the kingdom, save for the king himself, was terrified, what hope was there for the common citizen? The 1517 outbreak cemented the sweat's place in the Tudor mind. It was no longer a ghost. It was a seasonal monster. Each time the weather turned warm and damp, anxiety would begin to rise. People watched their neighbours with suspicion. A simple sneeze or a complaint of tiredness could cause panic in a household. It became an accepted though dreaded part of the rhythm of life. It was the English plague, the Tudor Anglicus, a national oddity as English as rain and wool. And this familiarity brought not comfort but a state of constant anxiety. The certainty that the question was not if the disease would return, but when. They lived under a hanging sentence, waiting for the next summer, the next outbreak, the next fatal sweat, and they would not have to wait long. For what was to come would make the horrors of 1508 and 1517 seem like mere practice runs. The background of anxiety was about to be torn apart by the disease's most brutal and terrifying performance. To date, the summer of 1528 found England in a state of feverish political and religious chaos. King Henry VIII was utterly consumed by what history would call his great matter, his desperate attempt to cancel his marriage of nearly 20 years to Catherine of Aragon. His motivation was twofold. On one hand, the need for a male heir which Catherine had failed to provide, giving him only a daughter, Mary. On the other, his overwhelming passion for a lady of the court. Intelligent, ambitious and captivating Anne Boleyn. This obsession was setting Henry on a collision course with the authority of the Pope in Rome and with the most powerful man in Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who happened to be Catherine's nephew. The tension at court was suffocating. Groups formed, loyalties were tested, and the future of the Church in England hung by a thread. It was into this whirlwind of legal manoeuvring and royal passion that the English sweat made its most spectacular and violent return. It appeared in late May in London, and this time there was no stealth. It was an explosion. The French ambassador Jean du Bellay, a sharp observer and a detailed writer, described the scene in his letters home with a mixture of horror and amazement. He reported that the disease was so swift and violent that it killed in 2 or 3 hours, sometimes less. People could be healthy and happy at supper and be a cold corpse before dawn. The panic that seized London was total. Du Bellay wrote that the normally busy streets were deserted. The only sound was the rattling of the death carts and the sad tolling of church bells, which did not stop day or night. At the height of the outbreak, an estimated 2,000 people were dying each day in the capital alone. The law courts closed. Business ground to a halt. London became a ghost city, paralysed by fear. And at the heart of this panic was the king, Henry VIII, the monarch who presented himself as a godlike figure, the embodiment of power and majesty, proved to be deeply, humanly, mortally afraid. His reaction was not one of calm leadership, but of pure, unbridled paranoia. For Henry, the disease was not just a physical threat. It was a divine judgment in his mind. Could this be a sign of God's displeasure with his great matter? This theological doubt, combined with a sharp instinct for self-preservation, turned him into a fugitive in his own kingdom. His first move was drastic. He dissolved the court, the nerve center of Tudor government and society, with its crowd of courtiers, servants, and petitioners, was scattered to the four winds. It was a quarantine measure on a royal scale. Anyone who had been in London was forbidden from approaching the king on pain of death. Then Henry began to move, and he did not stop. His route of escape is proof of his terror. He first retreated to Waltham Abbey, a home at a safe distance from London. But soon news came that the Sweat had appeared nearby. So he moved again, this time to Hunsdon, then to Tittenhanger, a remote country house in Hertfordshire, owned by the Abbot of St. Albans, chosen specifically for its isolation. He travelled with a minimal group, reduced to his most intimate servants and his personal physician. Even Queen Catherine was sent away to a separate home, a decision that was as much a health precaution as it was a reflection of their growing separation. Henry wanted to be alone. His life at Tittenhanger and other temporary homes became a fortress of obsessive rules. No one could enter his presence without first going through a period of isolation. Every letter, every message was likely fumigated or handled with tools before it reached his hands. He surrounded himself with a wall of fear. The king, the defender of the faith, the man who would take on the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, was in essence playing hide-and-seek with a microbe. He spent his days not only hiding, but also practicing medicine. Henry prided himself on his knowledge of remedies and herbs. He had his own still room and spent hours making ointments and potions. During the 1528 outbreak, he threw himself into this task with a feverish intensity. He drew up his own recipes against the Sweat, a mixture of herbs that he claimed could prevent or cure the disease. He sent copies of these recipes to his nobles, a gesture of royal generosity that also betrayed his own obsession. It is an extraordinary image. The most powerful king in England, locked in a room, pounding herbs in a mortar, trying desperately to craft a shield against a disease his best physicians could not understand. Absolute power was faced by absolute helplessness, and helplessness was winning. His fear was not unfounded. The disease was creeping ever closer. Several members of his own Privy Council fell ill. His brother-in-law, the husband of his sister Mary, died. The death of Sir William Compton, one of his closest and oldest friends, the keeper of his privy purse, hit him especially hard. Compton was a man of his innermost circle, a companion of jousts and revels in his youth. His death reminded Henry that the Sweat respected neither friendship nor rank. It could take anyone at any time. Every report of a new victim in his circle only served to fuel his paranoia and strengthen the walls, both physical and mental, he had built around himself. He confessed daily and received communion, preparing himself for the worst, despite his frantic efforts to avoid it. The fugitive king was trapped not by enemy armies, but by his own fear of an invisible threat that seemed to be closing in around him. But while the king barricaded himself in his fortress of solitude and fear at Tittenhanger, the disease demonstrated a cruel irony and a terrifying reach. It did not respect walls or privilege. It cared not for matters of state or passions of the heart. And with an almost evil aim, it went seeking the one person for whom Henry was risking his kingdom and his soul. Anne Boleyn, the centre of England's political crisis, was not with the king during his flight. She had been sent away from court, partly for propriety and partly for her own safety. As the negotiations with Rome reached a critical point, she retired to her family home, the impressive Hever Castle in Kent, a place of moats, gardens, and relative peace. There, surrounded by her ambitious father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, and her charismatic brother George, she awaited the outcome of the king's great gamble. It was at Hever that the Sweat found her. The news reached Henry like a lightning bolt. One of Anne's servants, a man named William Carey, who was also the husband of Anne's sister Mary, caught the disease and died quickly. The infection was now within the walls of his beloved's castle. Henry's panic, already raised to an almost unbearable level, skyrocketed. The woman for whom he was defying the papacy, risking war with the emperor and tearing apart the stability of his kingdom, was now at the mercy of the most lethal plague England knew. And then came the worst possible news. Anne herself had fallen ill. Henry's reaction was immediate and telling. All of his fear for himself seemed to transfer to her. He cast aside his strict isolation and acted. He immediately sent his second-best physician, Dr. Butts, to Havre, with clear instructions to spare no effort or expense to save her. Henry himself is said to have written frantic letters to Anne, filled with anguish and his own homemade medical advice, urging her to have courage and to follow the physician's instructions. These letters, if they survived, would offer an unmatched glimpse into the mind of a tyrant terrified of losing his love. The fate of the English Reformation at that moment rested not on theologians or diplomats, but on the constitution of a woman in her 20s fighting a violent fever in a castle in Kent. The situation at Havre was desperate. It was not only Anne who was sick. Her father, Sir Thomas, also caught the sweat, and shortly after her brother George. The Boleyn family, the rising group whose power depended entirely on royal favour and the promise of Anne's womb, was on the brink of destruction. Had all three died, history would have been very different. Henry might have interpreted their loss as a terrible sign from God, a punishment for his lust and defiance. He might have made peace with Catherine. The break with Rome might never have happened. Everything hung by a thread. But then what many in that superstitious age could only describe as a miracle occurred. Anne Boleyn survived. Her illness was severe, but her youth and her strength, or perhaps simply blind luck, saw her through. Slowly, the fever went down. The heavy sweating stopped. The colour returned to her cheeks. She recovered. Her father and brother too managed to pull through the sickness. The Boleyn clan, though shaken, had survived intact. For Henry, awaiting news in his claustrophobic isolation, Anne's recovery was not a simple relief. It was a sign. In an age when the hand of God was seen in every harvest, every storm, and every sickness, Anne's survival in the face of a plague that killed thousands could not be a coincidence. It had to be providence. God had saved her. God therefore approved of his cause. Her survival not only reaffirmed Henry's love, it blessed his mission. Any doubts he may have had, any fears that he was acting against the divine will were erased. If God had saved Anne from the English sweat, it was surely because she was destined to be the Queen of England and the mother of the future king. The impact of this episode on the king's inner circle was huge. It showed on the one hand the vulnerability of all. The sweat made no distinctions, but Anne's survival elevated her. It marked her as someone special, someone protected by higher powers. To her supporters, it was proof of her rightness. To her enemies, it was a frustrating blow and perhaps proof of witchcraft, as some whispered in the shadows. When Anne was strong enough to travel, she returned to court, or rather to the king's travelling location. Their reunion must have been one of immense relief and renewed determination. They had faced death, and they had won. The crisis of the sweat, which had threatened to destroy their plans, had in fact strengthened them. The disease had tested their bond, and in Henry's eyes, Providence had blessed it. The fugitive king emerged from his hiding, not humbled, but with his resolve hardened to iron. He had survived. Anne had survived, and now nothing and no one, not even the Pope in Rome, would stand in his way. The mysterious plague had unwittingly added an almost religious intensity to the king's obsession, pushing England one step closer to separation and to a future that no one could have foreseen. For 4 devastating outbreaks, the English sweat had behaved in a way with a strange patriotic courtesy. It was a distinctly English misery, a terror confined to the island. The merchants of Calais, just across the English Channel, could hear the rumours and see the quarantine ships, but the sickness never seemed to bother itself with the short sea crossing. It was as if the salt water of the Channel were an impossible barrier, a line drawn upon the map that the fog, or whatever it was, refused to cross. This geographic reliability, as terrible as it was, offered a strange sort of comfort. It was their plague for them to endure, but in the summer of 1529, everything changed. For the first and only time in its dreadful history, the English sweat decided to travel abroad. It all began, as it always did, in London in May of 1528. The outbreak was particularly violent, sweeping through the court and the city with a renewed fury. But by the autumn, as was its custom, it had vanished. A collective sigh of relief was breathed. The monster had returned to its lair. No one suspected that rather than sleeping, it was simply packing its bags. The following spring, the disease did not re-emerge in England. The silence was unsettling. And then in late July of 1529, news arrived from across the North Sea. Impossible news. The sweat had appeared in Hamburg. Hamburg was one of the jewels of the Hanseatic League, a bustling port city, teeming with sailors, merchants, and goods from all over the known world. It was the perfect place for a disease to make its continental debut. On July 25th, the first cases were reported. Within hours, the city was thrown into a panic that Londoners would have recognized instantly. City historians wrote of a flying death that killed its victims in 6 or 7 hours. The pattern was hauntingly familiar. A sudden chill, sharp pains, a torrential and foul-smelling sweat, and then, for many, the end. In the first few weeks, it is said that over 1,000 people died. The physicians of Hamburg, who had only heard of the disease through second-hand tales of terror, were utterly confused. They called it der englische Schweiß, the English sweat. The name stuck, a label of origin for an unwanted export. From Hamburg, the plague spread like ink spilled upon a map. It followed the arteries of Hanseatic trade with terrifying efficiency eastward along the Baltic coast. It reached the great city of Lübeck, then Stettin, Danzig, and Königsberg. Ships sailing from infected ports carried death in their holds alongside grain and timber. Northward, it crossed into Denmark, devastating towns and crippling the kingdom. It then leapt across the sea to Norway and Sweden, reaching as far north as Stockholm. It was a remarkably adaptable germ, indifferent to the Baltic climate, as comfortable in the fjords of Scandinavia as it was in the valleys of the Thames. Meanwhile, it moved south deep into the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. It followed the course of the river Elbe, a highway for barges and commerce. It infected Brandenburg, Saxony, and Thuringia. In Wittenberg, the home of Martin Luther, the university closed and fled to Jena. Luther, ever defiant, remained writing letters that blended theological comfort with practical public health advice. He, like many others, saw it as a punishment from God, a punishment for the sins of the world. It was a logical interpretation, perhaps the only one that made sense in a world where healthy men could eat breakfast and be dead before supper. The disease crept onward and inexorably, a spreading stain. It reached the Low Countries, causing panic in Antwerp and Amsterdam. It travelled south to the Swiss Confederation, where the Alpine city-states, which prided themselves on their pure mountain air, discovered that not even the heights of the Alps offered protection. Zurich, Basel, and Bern all suffered terribly. The Swiss reformer Huldrych Zwingli wrote of the plague with fear and wonder, marvelling at its speed and ferocity. But the strangest thing about this continental tour was where it did not go. It did not touch France. Despite the constant commercial and diplomatic traffic across the Channel, the disease seemed to draw an invisible line at the border, nor did it enter Spain or Italy. The Italian peninsula, with its densely packed city-states and centuries of experience with the Black Death, was spared entirely. The sweat confined itself largely to northern and central Europe, to the Germanic and Scandinavian-speaking peoples. Why? No one knows. Perhaps it was pure chance, a quirk of the trade routes of that particular summer. Or perhaps the germ, whatever it was, had some connection or weakness related to the diet, genetics, or climate of those regions. It is one of the many unsolved mysteries of the disease, a geographical ghost that haunts historians. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the English sweat's European tour ended. By late September of 1529, cases began to dwindle. By October, the epidemic on the continent was gone. It left behind a trail of thousands dead, disrupted economies, and a deep, lingering fear. But it did not return. The English sweat retreated to its homeland once more, leaving the rest of Europe to wonder what on earth had just happened. Never again would it cross the Channel. The 1529 outbreak was an oddity, a terrifying one-time trip that proved the English monster could, if it chose, travel the world. The experience left a scar on the European mind and solidified the disease's name forever, the English sweat. It was a reminder that in the age of discovery, it was not only ideas and goods that crossed borders. Sometimes nightmares did too. Faced with a threat so swift, so incomprehensible, and so deadly, 16th century society reacted with the only toolkit it possessed, a mixture of outdated medical science, religious intensity, and a basic instinct for survival. The result was a landscape of useless remedies and desperate prayers, a sad testament to humanity's utter helplessness in the face of an invisible enemy. The medical response was firmly rooted in the theory of humours, a system inherited from the ancient Greeks, particularly Galen, which had controlled Western medical thought for over 1,000 years. The core idea was simple. The human body contained 4 primary fluids or humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was the result of a perfect balance between these 4. Sickness, therefore, was an imbalance, an excess or lack of one or more humors. The physician's job was not so much to kill an infectious agent, a concept that would not exist for another 300 years, but to help the body rebalance its internal fluids. Viewed through this lens, the English sweat presented a strange puzzle. The most dramatic and defining symptom, the heavy sweating, was interpreted as the body's violent, desperate attempt to expel a harmful humor, a toxin, or a poisonous vapor that had invaded the system. The logic, therefore, seemed clear. If the body is trying to sweat out the poison, then the best way to help it is to make it sweat even more. Thus was born the standard and likely fatal treatment for the English sweat. When a person showed the first signs, the chill, the headache, they were immediately put to bed. This was no gentle rest. It was a forced fever confinement. Layers upon layers of heavy woolen blankets, furs, and any available insulating fabrics were piled upon the patient. All windows and doors were shut. Cracks were stuffed to prevent even the slightest draught. The air in the room would grow thick, hot, and stagnant. A roaring fire was lit in the hearth, even in the height of summer. The goal was to create a small climate of suffocating heat, a personal furnace to cause and maintain a torrential sweat. The patient would be given hot spice liquids to drink, posset broths laced with pepper and other hot spices believed to promote sweating from within. The ordeal was to last for exactly 24 hours. This was believed to be the full cycle of the disease. If you survived that day and night in your self-imposed oven, you had a chance. To move, to uncover yourself, to let even a single toe grow cool was considered an instant death sentence. The cold, it was believed, would cause the pores of the skin to close, trapping the poison inside the body, where it would attack the heart and vital organs. There is a dark, tragic irony in all of this. The cure was a perfect imitation of the disease at its worst. It is highly probable that this treatment killed many people who might otherwise have survived. The extreme loss of water caused by the forced sweating combined with the risk of heat stroke from overheating likely pushed many already stressed bodies past their limit. They were in effect fighting fire with a flamethrower. Other remedies popular in the 16th century medicine chest were also tried with equal lack of success. Bloodletting, the cure-all for almost everything, was sometimes used, though less frequently than for other illnesses. The logic was to rebalance the humors by drawing off excess blood. But since the sweat did not present with the typical signs of an excess of blood, many physicians hesitated. Herbal mixtures were brewed and given. The great Tudor theriac, a complex mixture of herbs, spices, and sometimes more exotic ingredients like ground unicorn horn, likely narwhal tusk, was a popular and expensive remedy. Potions based on wormwood, rue, and other bitter herbs were used in the hope that their strength might combat the internal poison. None of them worked. They were gestures of desperation, herbal plasters on an artillery wound. When science proved useless, people turned to God. To the 16th century mind, a plague of this size could not be a mere accident of nature. It was a show of divine anger, a punishment for the sinfulness of the nation, the community, the individual. The response, therefore, had to be spiritual. Church bells tolled ceaselessly, not just for the dead, but to call the living to repentance. Religious processions were organized where priests and lay people would walk through the streets, often barefoot and in rough cloth, chanting prayers and whipping themselves to atone for their sins. Days of public fasting and prayer were declared. Sermons from the pulpits thundered with warnings of the end times and the need to change one's life. These displays of public piety were as much an attempt to calm an angry God as they were a way for the community to collectively process an unbearable trauma. Alongside these medical and spiritual efforts, the first crude forms of public health emerged. Though they did not understand germs, they understood the concept of contagion. They knew that the disease seemed to spread from person to person and place to place. As a result, civic authorities took drastic measures to try to contain its spread. Quarantine was the primary tool. Cities would shut their gates to travelers from infected areas. Guards would be posted on the roads to enforce travel restrictions. Within the cities, houses with the sick were marked, often with a red cross painted on the door and the words, "Lord have mercy upon us." The inhabitants of that house, both sick and healthy, were forcibly locked inside for weeks, with watchmen posted outside to ensure they did not leave. Food was passed to them in baskets on long poles. It was a virtual death sentence for the entire household. Public gatherings were forbidden. Theatres, inns, taverns and brothels were closed. Fairs and markets were cancelled. The goal was to stop human contact. In the streets, people walked with vinegar-soaked handkerchiefs or bunches of sweet-smelling herbs pressed to their noses and mouths, hoping the strong smells could purify the bad air or miasma that was believed to carry the disease. The air itself was seen as the enemy. Bonfires were lit in the streets, filling the air with the harsh smoke of juniper wood or tar in an attempt to cleanse the atmosphere. In the end, none of it made any real difference to the course of the epidemic. The medical treatments were useless at best and harmful at worst. The public health measures, though well-intentioned, were too inconsistent to stop such a fast-moving enemy. And the prayers, while comforting to the soul, did not stop the killing. The English sweat came when it wanted, killed whom it wanted, and left when it was tired. The experience left physicians humbled, priests questioning, and the common people terrified. It was a brutal lesson in the limits of human knowledge and the overwhelming power of nature. The only real defense, as they bitterly discovered, was to flee, and for most, even that was not an option. Amid this whirlwind of panic, folk remedies and religious intensity, one voice rose to try and impose an intellectual order on the chaos. It was the voice of a man who not only witnessed the final great attack of the disease, but also took the trouble to document it with the rigor of a scholar and the urgency of a frontline physician. His name was John Caius, and his short book, published in 1552, would become the single most important document we have on the English sweat, our only truly clear window into the clinical experience of this forgotten plague. John Caius, pronounced Keys, was no fake or village healer. He was one of the most brilliant medical minds of his generation. Educated at Cambridge and then at the prestigious University of Padua in Italy, the centre of Renaissance medical learning, Caius was a true Renaissance man. He was a humanist, a classicist, and a physician who served several Tudor monarchs, including Edward VI, Mary the Fur, and Elizabeth the Fair. He would later become president of the Royal College of Physicians in London 9 times, a figure of immense authority in the English medical establishment. In the summer of 1551, the English sweat returned for its 5th and final appearance. It had been 23 years since the last major outbreak in England. Long enough for a new generation to grow up without knowing the terror firsthand. But the old remembered. The disease first appeared in Shrewsbury in April, then spread across the country with its characteristic speed, reaching London by July. The capital was once again plunged into panic. Deaths were counted in the hundreds each day. It was in the midst of this epidemic that John Caius, then practicing in London, came face to face with the legendary sweating sickness. Unlike many of his colleagues who either simply applied the traditional cures or fled the city, Caius observed. He took notes, he analysed, he looked for patterns, and then the following year, when the plague had vanished for good, he published his findings. The book had a long descriptive title typical of the era, a book or counsel against the disease commonly called the sweat or sweating sickness. It was not a dense scholarly book written in Latin for other scholars. Caius wrote it in plain English addressing his fellow citizens. It was a public health manual, a practical guide to survival, the first and only complete medical account of the disease by an eyewitness. Thanks to Caius, we have a detailed clinical description of the symptoms and progression of the illness. He is the reason we know as much as we do. His account begins by describing the onset, which was always sudden and terrifying. There was no long, slow growth period. A person could be perfectly healthy one moment and in the next feel a pain in the head and in the heart. This was followed almost immediately by a deep chill so violent that the victim's teeth would chatter and their body would shake uncontrollably. Caius noted this chill could last anywhere from half an hour to 3 hours. After the cold came the heat, and with it the symptom that gave the disease its name. Immediately after, Caius wrote, followeth the sweat. Not a gentle, helpful and good sweat, but a great sharp and stinking sweat. He described how the sweat poured from every pore, drenching the bedding and filling the room with a distinctive foul odour. Along with the sweat came other distressing symptoms: a splitting headache, delirium, heart palpitations, an unquenchable thirst, and extreme exhaustion. Patients often felt an oppressive heaviness and an overwhelming desire to sleep. Caius warned strongly against this, believing, like others, that to give in to sleep was to give in to death. Speed was the defining characteristic. Caius stressed that the entire drama, from the first chill to the outcome, be it recovery or death, often happened in less than a day. He that was merry at dinner, he wrote, might be dead by supper. This quickness was what terrified people the most. There was no time to put one's affairs in order, no time for goodbyes. Life could be extinguished in the blink of an eye. Caius also made crucial observations about patterns. He noted that the disease did not seem to strike randomly. It appeared to have a strange preference for certain groups. It affected men more than women, and the rich more than the poor. Noblemen, wealthy merchants, well-fed clergymen, and strong craftsmen seemed to be its favourite victims. The very young and the very old, on the other hand, were often spared. This was the complete opposite of the Black Death, which ravaged the poor and malnourished in overcrowded slums. The sweat, by contrast, was a plague of the well-to-do, a disease that seemed to prefer strong and fleshy Englishmen. This observation has puzzled historians and disease experts for centuries, and remains one of the most important clues in the search for the germ's identity. As for the cause, Caius followed the popular miasma theory. He blamed evil vapours and fumes rising from the earth, especially in times of heavy rain followed by heat. He believed these corrupt airs entered the body and poisoned the blood. Though his understanding of cause was mistaken, his emphasis on environmental factors was remarkable for his time. His advice for treatment was in essence a refined and organised version of the folk cure. He advocated for the 24-hour sweating routine, but with strict guidelines. He detailed the type of clothing to be worn, the number of blankets to be piled on, and the diet to be followed. He strictly forbade cold air and warned against the slightest movement. His approach was methodical and authoritative, while the treatment itself was likely useless. The fact that a distinguished physician was providing a clear, confident method must have offered immense psychological comfort to a terrified population. It gave them something to do, a set of rules to follow in the midst of chaos. John Caius's little book is a treasure. It is a remarkable document of clinical observation, an artifact of 16th century medicine, and a human testament to a time of fear. Without it, the English sweat would be little more than a footnote in the records of history, a mysterious mention in Tudor chronicles. But thanks to the diligence and the pen of Caius, we can look the plague squarely in the eye. We can feel the chill, smell the sweat, and understand the terror of watching a loved one pass from vitality to death in the course of a few short hours. Caius did not solve the mystery of the English sweat, but he made sure we would never forget it. He gave the disease a biography, and in so doing, he left to us the puzzle we are still trying to solve today. The year of our Lord 1551 had begun with a deceptive calm. 23 years had passed since the sweat had last swept through the lands of England, a span of time long enough for a new generation of young people to grow up without knowing its deadly breath, without having seen their parents gaze at the sky with a primal dread at the coming of each hot and humid summer. Collective memory, however, is a stubborn beast. The old remembered. Physicians, like the brilliant John Caius, remembered, and the terror, crouching in the shadows of memory, was simply biding its time to emerge once more. In April of that year, the moment arrived, not in bustling, polluted London, but far away to the west, in the town of Shrewsbury, nestled in a bend of the River Severn. It was a picturesque place, a trading hub for wool, with its timber-framed houses and winding streets, and it was there that the sickness, like an old acquaintance returning uninvited, knocked upon the first door. A man, then a woman, then an entire family awoke in the middle of the night, drenched in a cold, thick sweat that smelled of the grave. The sense of dread, the throbbing headache, the chill that sank deep into the bones. The symptoms were unmistakable. The sweat had returned. From Shrewsbury, the disease spread with a speed that defied the logic of the age. It moved not at the pace of an ox cart, as the bubonic plague so often did, but at the speed of panic. It leaped from Shrewsbury to Ludlow, then crept north to Chester and east to Coventry. In each place, the story was the same. It arrived without warning, struck with an unheard-of fury for a day or two, and then vanished, leaving in its wake a trail of widows, orphans, and a deathly silence in the streets. It seemed to prefer, as always, young and strong men, the wealthy and well-fed, those who were in the prime of their lives. It was a plague with a taste for irony, a predator that ignored the weak and revelled in felling the strong. By July, the sweat had reached the gates of London. The city, Under the reign of the young and sickly Protestant king, Edward VI, braced for the attack. The king and his court retreated to the relative safety of Hampton Court upriver, surrounding themselves with physicians and precautions. But for the hundreds of thousands of souls trapped in the web of London streets, there was no escape. On July 7th, the sweat breached the city walls. The outbreak that followed was by all accounts the most violent and deadly of all. John Caius, who was in the city and became the principal chronicler of this final plague, wrote of an atmosphere of utter despair. The church bells tolled without pause day and night, a grim accompaniment to the rattle of the carts that collected the dead. Shops closed, markets emptied, social life ground to a halt. Inviting a friend to dinner was not an act of hospitality, but a potential death sentence. People died so quickly that there was no time for proper funeral rites. Caius claimed that at the epidemic's peak, over 1,000 people were dying each day, a figure likely exaggerated by trauma, but one that conveys the scale of the terror. People died in their beds, in the streets, at their places of work. A death so swift it was almost an insult, and it was during this final outbreak that the disease claimed its most famous victims. A blow so cruel and so public that it echoed throughout the Tudor hierarchy. The victims were the young Dukes of Suffolk, Henry and Charles Brandon. They were the sons of the impressive Catherine Willoughby, Duchess of Suffolk, a woman of great intelligence, Protestant conviction, and one of the wealthiest landowners in England. Her sons were the very image of the promise of the new Edwardian age, young, brilliant, educated, and destined for great things. Henry, aged 16, and Charles, 14, were students at St. John's College, Cambridge, a centre of Renaissance learning. When the sweat began to spread, their mother, like any terrified parent, pulled them from the university, believing the country air would be safer. They took refuge in a house in the village of Buckden in Huntingdonshire, but the sweat was a relentless hunter. It cared not for college walls, nor the peace of the countryside. On July 14th, it found the brothers. Henry the Elder fell ill first. It was a brief and brutal battle. Despite all the care, despite all of his mother's desperate prayers, the young Duke died from the disease that very afternoon. At the moment of his death, the title of Duke of Suffolk passed instantly to his younger brother, Charles. But Charles Brandon's dukedom would last less than an hour. As his brother lay dead in one room, Charles began to show the same terrifying symptoms in another. Half an hour later, he too was gone. In the span of a single afternoon, Catherine Willoughby had lost both of her sons. In the span of a single hour, England had lost 2 Dukes of Suffolk. The news spread like wildfire, a devastating symbol of the nation's helplessness. If not even the wealth, title, and noble blood of the Brandons could protect them, what hope was there for anyone else? The outbreak of 1551 consumed England for the entire summer, a feverish hell that seemed to have no end. But like its predecessors, its fury was as brief as it was intense. As the summer heat faded and the cooler winds of autumn arrived, the cases began to dwindle. By the end of September, the disease had vanished completely. The church bells stopped their tolling. The death carts ceased their rounds. People cautiously began to emerge from their homes, blinking in the sunlight of a world that had been changed forever. They had survived the last and most terrible breath of the English sweat. They did not know it at the time. Of course, they expected its return the next summer and the one after that, but it never came back. After 66 years of off-and-on terror, after 5 waves of death and panic, the English sweat, the mysterious plague of the Tudors, vanished into the mists of history as silently and mysteriously as it had arrived. And so began one of the greatest riddles in medical history. Why did it disappear? Diseases do not usually do that. The bubonic plague returned in waves for centuries. Smallpox was a constant, terrible companion to humanity, until it was eliminated by vaccination. Influenza mutates and returns each year in a new form. But the English sweat simply stopped. It was gone. The book of its history was slammed shut on the final page with no epilogue, no explanation. For centuries, this question has baffled historians and scientists alike. It is a cold case, a mystery that delves into the very heart of how we interact with the diseases that haunt us. One of the first and simplest theories is that the English population simply developed an immunity. After 5 outbreaks across 3 generations, it is possible that enough people had survived the disease and passed on their resistance, creating a form of herd immunity. The germ, finding itself without a sufficient number of vulnerable hosts, simply could not sustain its cycle of infection and died out. It sounds reasonable, but there is a significant problem with this idea. the long gaps between outbreaks, especially the 23-year gap between 1528 and 1551. By the time the final outbreak arrived, an entire generation of English people had been born and raised with no exposure to the sweat. They were in theory a fertile and untouched field for infection, and indeed, it was the young who were hardest hit. If herd immunity were the sole answer, the 1551 outbreak might not have been so severe, or perhaps it might not have happened at all. Immunity on its own does not seem to be a complete explanation for such a total and permanent disappearance. Another line of thought focuses on the germ itself. Perhaps the disease simply evolved into a less lethal form. Germs, from an evolutionary perspective, do not want to kill their hosts. A dead host is a dead end for transmission. The success of a virus or bacterium often lies in its ability to spread widely, which often means becoming less violent over time. It is possible that the sweat mutated into a milder illness, perhaps a common cold or a seasonal flu, losing the terrifying characteristics that defined it. Or conversely, it might have been a victim of its own dark success. A disease that kills its host in a matter of hours, sometimes in as few as 3 or 4, has a very narrow window of opportunity to be transmitted to someone else. It is possible that in the 1551 outbreak, the sweat was so aggressive, so efficiently lethal that it literally burned itself out. It destroyed its victims so quickly that it cut its own chains of transmission, driving itself to extinction along with its final hosts. A kind of tiny suicide, a final blaze of glory before the darkness. Yet, one of the most fascinating and enduring theories looks away from human biology and towards the sky and the earth. Climate change. The Tudor era falls within a larger climate period known as the Little Ice Age, a time of generally cooler global temperatures. However, the years of the sweat outbreaks, 1485, 1508, 1507, 1528, and 1551, stand out in the records for having unusually warm and, above all, wet summers. The chroniclers of the time speak constantly of torrential rains, floods, dense fogs, and a heavy stagnant air that came before the arrival of the disease. This connection to the weather is too consistent to be a coincidence. This suggests that the germ, or perhaps its carrier, the animal that transmitted it, like an insect or a rodent, thrived in very specific conditions of heat and humidity. If this were the case, the disappearance of the sweat could be explained by a subtle but sustained shift in England's climate after the mid-16th century. As the Little Ice Age took firmer hold with cooler and drier summers, the conditions that allowed the sweat to grow simply ceased to exist. The ecosystem that sustained it was changed, and the monster, unable to adapt, retreated into its slumber, never to awaken again. This theory is appealing because it fits with the observations of the time and provides an elegant explanation for its sudden and permanent disappearance. The sweat was not defeated. The world that had created it simply ceased to exist. Whatever the reason or combination of reasons, the result was the same. The English sweat became a ghost, a horror story that grandparents told their grandchildren by the fire. The disease that had defined the terror of a dynasty, that had made kings and cardinals tremble, had vanished. The case went cold. For nearly 400 years, the sweat remained in the domain of historians and antiquarians, a curious footnote in the records of plague. But modern science, with its endless curiosity and its new tools, loves a cold case. And in the 20th century, researchers began to dust off the old files, to reread the eyewitness accounts, not as chronicles of a past terror, but as evidence reports. The goal was no longer simply to describe the sweat, but to identify it. The hunt for the culprit began. The modern investigation into the identity of the English sweat is a fascinating exercise in historical disease study. With no tissue samples, no ancient DNA to extract from the bones of victims, the germ killed too quickly to leave its mark on the skeleton. The only available evidence is the written testimony. The accounts of Polydore Virgil, of Thomas More, and above all the detailed clinical description by John Caius in his 1552 book, a boke or counsel against the disease commonly called the sweat. These texts became the crime scene. Scientists began to analyze them line by line, symptom by symptom, searching for a pattern that would match a disease known today. It was a matter of creating a profile of the killer based solely on the accounts of terrified survivors. One of the first modern theories to be considered was some form of anthrax. This idea arose from the rapid lethality of the disease and the importance of the wool industry in Tudor England. Anthrax is caused by a bacterium Bacillus anthracis, whose spores can be found in animal products such as wool. The breathing in of anthrax spores can lead to a deadly lung illness, with symptoms like fever, shortness of breath, and shock, leading to death in a short period. The connection seemed plausible. Wool workers could have been exposed to spores in imported bales, and the disease could have spread from there. However, the anthrax theory quickly falls apart under closer look. The most characteristic and universally described symptom of the English sweat was, well, the sweat. A heavy, sticky, and foul-smelling sweat. This is not a typical symptom of anthrax. Furthermore, inhalation anthrax is not easily transmitted from person to person. The sweat, by contrast, spread like wildfire, leaping from house to house, town to town, in a way that strongly suggests human-to-human transmission. The profile simply did not fit. Anthrax was dismissed as an unlikely suspect. A much stronger candidate, and one that has long had its supporters, is a violent and now extinct form of influenza. The flu, after all, fits in many respects. It is known for causing explosive epidemics that spread rapidly through a population. It brings high fever, body aches, headache, and breathing symptoms, all of which are mentioned in the accounts of the sweat. The famous 1918 flu pandemic, wrongly named the Spanish flu, also showed an unusual fondness for young, healthy adults, the same group the sweat seemed to prefer. This overlap in the victim profile is one of the strongest arguments in favor of the influenza theory. Perhaps the English sweat was simply a particularly strange and aggressive strain of flu that emerged in the 15th century and then disappeared, outcompeted by other strains. But again, there are problems. The description of the sweat symptoms has oddities that do not quite align with influenza. The torrential sweat, once more, is the main obstacle. While the flu can cause sweating, it is not described in the extreme, constant, and bad-smelling way that the Tudor chroniclers do. Furthermore, the sweat often began with a sense of dread and chills, followed by pain in the neck, shoulders, and limbs before the fever and breathing problems appeared. And while the 1918 flu sometimes caused death within 24 hours, the speed of the sweat seems to have been even more dizzying. Finally, influenza tends to be a winter disease thriving in the cold, dry air that forces people to gather indoors. The sweat was clearly a summer sickness appearing with the heat and humidity. Although influenza is a compelling suspect, the differences are enough to keep the verdict in doubt. It is like a composite sketch that resembles the culprit, but whose eyes are the wrong color. In recent decades, a new prime suspect has emerged, one that seems to fit the profile in an almost uncanny way: a hantavirus. Hantaviruses are a family of viruses typically carried by rodents such as mice and rats, and are transmitted to humans through the breathing in of tiny particles from rodent urine, droppings, or saliva. Most people have never heard of them, but one of the diseases they cause, hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, HPS, presents a clinical picture that is chillingly similar to the English sweat. The connection was first made in earnest in the late 20th century. HPS begins suddenly with fever, chills, and intense muscle aches, symptoms that perfectly match the initial phase of the sweat. This is followed by a phase in which the lungs rapidly fill with fluid, leading to severe breathing distress and a feeling of drowning. This matches the Tudor chroniclers' descriptions of a pain in the chest, shortness of breath, and death by suffocation. The progression is incredibly swift, and the death rate for HPS is very high, often over 30%, which aligns with the lethal nature of the sweat. Furthermore, and crucially, HPS also tends to affect young, healthy adults more. Their strong immune systems often overreact to the virus, triggering a cytokine storm that is what actually causes the fatal lung damage. The environmental connection is also remarkable. Hantavirus outbreaks are often linked to climate changes that lead to a boom in the rodent population. A period of heavy rain followed by warmth, exactly the conditions described in the summers of the sweat, can lead to an explosion in vegetation. More food means more rodents. More rodents mean more contact with humans, especially in rural settings, or in cities with poor sanitation like those of Tudor England. The 1485 outbreak, for example, which followed the arrival of Henry Tudor with his army, took place after an exceptionally rainy summer. Soldiers sleeping in the open in barns and in country houses would have been in a prime position to breathe in rodent-contaminated dust. There is one major problem with the hantavirus theory. One piece of the puzzle that doesn't fit: transmission. The hantaviruses we know today, like the sin nombre virus in North America, are almost never transmitted from person to person. Infection comes from exposure to rodents, but the English sweat clearly spread between humans. People nursing the sick were often the next to fall ill. Yet this is where the mystery deepens. A South American strain of hantavirus, the Andes virus, has been shown to be capable of person-to-person transmission. This opens up a tantalizing possibility. What if the English sweat was caused by a now extinct European hantavirus that, like its South American cousin, had evolved the ability to spread between humans? This unified hypothesis is to date the one that best explains all the strange characteristics of the English sweat. It explains the specific symptoms from muscle aches to breathing failure. It explains the victim profile of young, healthy adults. It explains the connection to warm, wet summers and the possible environmental trigger. And it explains both the sudden appearance of the disease, a disease jumping from animals to humans, and its explosive spread thanks to person-to-person transmission. It might even explain its disappearance. If the virus depended on a specific rodent species, which in turn depended on very particular climate conditions, a change in any of those factors could have broken the chain of transmission for good. But however compelling it may be, it remains just a theory. Without a time machine or the miraculous discovery of a preserved biological sample, the culprit behind the English sweat remains officially on history's most wanted list. The ghost that haunted the Tudors remains unidentified, its true nature hidden behind a 500-year-old veil. The search continues, a reminder that sometimes the most frightening stories are not the ones with a monster at the end, but the ones that leave the door open to doubt, allowing the imagination to wander the dark corridors of the unknown as you gently drift off to sleep. Beyond the medical fascination and the detective story mystery, the English sweat left a deep and lasting scar on the mind and structure of Tudor England. It was not a plague on the same large scale as the Black Death, which destroyed nearly half of Europe's population. The sweat was more selective, more of a serial killer than a genocidal force, but its impact was disproportionate to its death toll, precisely because of who it chose to kill and how it did so. Its legacy is found not so much in empty census rolls, but in the paranoia of a king, the fragility of a line of succession, and the profound spiritual anxiety of an era. The political impact was perhaps the most tangible. The Tudor dynasty, fresh from the bloody and chaotic Wars of the Roses, based its legitimacy on stability and a clear line of succession. The sweat mocked both concepts. The disease showed in the most brutal fashion that royal blood offered no protection. The 1528 outbreak was particularly instructive. King Henry VIII, a man obsessed with his health and his male legacy, was reduced to a terrified fugitive within his own kingdom. He dissolved the court, separated from Queen Catherine, and moved compulsively from one home to another, often with a minimal group, trying to outrun the plague. The letters of the time reveal his panic. He wrote to an ailing Anne Boleyn, who caught the sweat and miraculously survived, expressing his deep fear and helplessness. For a moment, the most powerful monarch in Western Christendom was stripped of his majesty, reduced to a mortal man, fearing an enemy he could not see, behead, or imprison. This personal vulnerability undoubtedly fueled his already considerable paranoia and his determination to control every aspect of his realm, including his own succession. And that succession was shaped by the shadow of the sweat from the very beginning. Henry's older brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales, died in 1502 at Ludlow Castle. The official cause of his death is a mystery, often attributed to consumption or tuberculosis. However, his death occurred during a period of high disease activity, and an outbreak of the sweat was ravaging the region at that very time. Arthur's illness was swift and feverish, and his wife, Catherine of Aragon, also fell gravely ill, but survived. Did the heir to the Tudor throne die of the English sweat? It is impossible to say for certain, but the possibility is very real. If so, then the sweat is directly responsible for one of the greatest turning points in English history. Arthur's death brought Henry to the throne and set the stage for his marriage to his brother's widow, Catherine, and it was that marriage's failure to produce a male heir that led to Henry's obsession with an annulment, his break with the Church of Rome, and the creation of the Church of England. The English Reformation, with all its political, social and religious upheavals, may have had its roots in the death of a young prince from a mysterious illness in a Welsh castle. The sweat also destroyed the aristocracy and the ruling class in a way the Black Death never did. Its preference for healthy, well-fed adults meant it struck directly at the pillars of Tudor society: nobles, wealthy merchants, high-ranking clergy, lawyers, mayors. The 1517 outbreak in Oxford and Cambridge was so severe that the universities closed, and it is said that half the population of Oxford died. In 1528, the disease claimed the lives of two of the king's privy chamber gentlemen and the husband of Anne Boleyn's sister. The most devastating blow to the nobility came in the final outbreak in 1551. In a single day, Henry Brandon and Charles Brandon, the young Dukes of Suffolk, and sons of a close friend of Henry VIII, both died of the sweat within hours of each other. The extinction of a ducal line in an afternoon was a gruesome reminder of the fragility of power and lineage. These were not anonymous peasants. They were the future of England's ruling class, and they were being wiped from the map in a matter of hours. Each outbreak created a vacuum of power and expertise, destabilizing local government and central government. Culturally and psychologically, the impact was profound. Medieval and Renaissance Christendom was obsessed with the idea of the ars moriendi, the art of dying. Good death was one for which you had time to prepare. To confess your sins, receive last rites, say goodbye to family, and put your affairs in order. It was a ritualized process, a crucial final act in the drama of a soul's salvation. The English sweat destroyed this comfort. It was a disease that stole time. A man could be healthy at breakfast and dead before supper, with no time for the priest, no time for repentance. This speed created a massive spiritual anxiety. Death was no longer a predictable visitor, but a thief in the night. This sense of uncertainty filtered into the culture, into sermons, warning of the vanity of earthly life, and into the fatalism that gripped people during the summer months. Over time, as the disease faded, so did its memory in the popular consciousness. Unlike the Black Death, which persisted for centuries and left a permanent mark on European art, literature, and collective memory, the sweat was an intense but relatively brief terror. It lasted less than a century. When it was gone for good. Later generations, facing new plagues, smallpox, and war, gradually forgot the specific terror of the sweat. It became a historical footnote, a medical curiosity. Yet, its role as an actor in the Tudor drama is undeniable. It was a silent catalyst for change, an accelerator of royal paranoia, and a factor in the greatest religious upheaval in English history. It was the ghost at the feast of the Tudor court, the uninvited guest at every summer banquet, the whispered fear that proved that neither castle walls nor royal blood could keep death at bay. Though it is a forgotten plague today, the English sweat was a crucial force that helped to shape one of the most turbulent and transformative periods in history. A lethal mist whose passing left the landscape of England changed forever. The mystery of its identity persists, but the impact of its actions is carved into the very foundations of the nation. And so, the story of this strange illness comes to a close, dissolving into time like the very mist from which it seemed to emerge, leaving only questions and a haunting silence. A perfect silence in which to rest.